Even if I'm cast in a positive light, sure, that's great, right? But that is not a completely effortless, carefree experience either.
They may be showing me this way, but I'm also very much so human, right? Like there are elements of me who are very ready for marriage and very ready for relationship, etc. And there's parts of me that are not. Lesson 2.
Your archetype and boundaries. An archetype is a typical or relatable example of a certain kind of person. We see archetypes all the time in all forms of entertainment, including reality TV. In movies, the villain may be a jilted lover who wants to exact revenge. A controlling boss is another archetype we see all the time. There are also endearing archetypes, such as the carefree, nature-loving young woman whose life is full of wonder. When you sign up for reality TV, it's important to recognize that you are being cast to fulfill a specific archetype.
Now, before we go any further, I want to share our number one rule of reality TV participation. The show should always be part of your life. You are never part of it. But this is a game of strategy. To keep the show as a part of your life, you should know what you could be in its eyes or how you might be typecast. So let's consider your archetype, because that's going to shape what the show wants out of you and what you'll be expected to talk about.
But before we nail that down, let's also determine what you are willing and open to share with a program. We call these the rules of your world. Keep in mind that anything you share is liable to be broadcast to thousands, if not millions, of people. You'll want to curate your history and your identity. Are you comfortable letting people know about fetishes, past traumas, difficult relationships? What are your specific boundaries, and how can you maintain those boundaries while still giving the show what they want out of you? Can you tell us a little bit about what your archetype or archetypes may have been going into the show and what it ended up being?
Yeah, I think mine was interesting. I think the show labeled me as like Mr. Young and Ready, right? So this young, hopeless romantic who was looking for love and was a good person who was just, they wanted to find a good person for. But I think it's genuine. I think it's real. I felt authentic to me. I think it put me in a interesting like box in terms of, I think that I was portrayed, from what I saw, was portrayed genuinely like who I am. And I think that it put me on a pedestal that was kind of similar, kind of unfair, right? It was it preyed on this idea of, oh, is he too young to be able to be aware of like his emotions, and if he's ready for this process? What does ready mean? What does that look like? I think as a Black man who is an educator and like cares for people, is like this pillar of the community, is in touch with his feelings and emotions and can articulate those things. And it's like a non-threatening Black man, right? I think is a very safe archetype for me to be in, and I think that that's perceived well by other people.
Yeah, and I think it's an archetype we see all the time of like specifically Black male educators who are there for their communities, and it's like it is true to who you are. It is very real, but I also think that it was the archetype that you were fulfilling in the show. Yeah,
and I think it served me well as a person who doesn't see myself as a reality TV person or a celebrity. And I think it also served the show, right? To have someone who fit that mold. And I think also like for me and my best friend to also be Black men educators who are people who are doing things in their community, right? And so it served both purposes. And so I think that like it was an advantage to us and allowed for us to be shown authentically and in a positive light, and for Black men everywhere to be seen positively. And I think it also advantaged the show to be able to have two people who were friends who were doing this thing together. What was your archetype and how did that play out for you?
Yeah, my archetype, I think, was so the name that I was given was the romantic thespian, right? So
Fitting.
I think, there's a part of me that's according to this archetype. And again, there's truth to all of these things that they're pointing out about who I am, right? There's this person who is longing, right? Who has these ideals of what kind of relationship he could be in, right? And seeks that ideal person, that ideal nuclear relationship, right, with someone. I think the use of the word thespian, right? Obviously, I'm a theater person. They picked this like fancy word, right? Because I think part of my archetype is also that I'm this like deep philosophizing, kind of person. So I think those two together kind of shaped the archetype I was.
I think the show really played on, like, this is this thespian who lives in a tiny house and is like minimalist and like does things like out of the box. And I think trying to put you in a box as like a romantic thespian is limiting.
Part of me thinks, yeah, you're right. My archetype had more to do with my out of the box minimalism, the fact that I'm an artist, that I am this bohemian person who like pedicabs for a living, right? My more carefree, unconventional bent. And those were things that going into it, I was totally aware, like, yes, this is how I will be framed. This is how I will be perceived. And with that in mind, like, what are the dangers of this, right? What questions might they ask to kind of like advance that archetype that feel like they're not things I want to share, right? So that's one part of the question. And then the other part of the question is, how can I take advantage of this? How can I use this to kind of like advance how I'm perceived, right? And also like make this more enjoyable for me, right? Because if it's kind of a cool archetype to have, to be the quirky person, right? Because then I could just, it's safe. I could just, as long as I'm bringing in these absurd, ridiculous, funny things, like they're getting what they want out of me, So I can kind of treat it as this fun fantasy, this weird game, because that's the archetype that I fulfill. I am the thespian, the actor, the theater, the world builder, I'd love to hear more about how like the archetype that you were fulfilling for the show, how over the course of your experience on the show, how that shaped kind of your experience, whether there were any like moments that presented difficulty, whether there were moments when it was enjoyable for you and helpful too.
Similar to you, I felt like the archetype that I was given was safe and felt like good for me. I know that I'm an emotionally intelligent person. I'm very articulate. I'm able to communicate things. I'm able to reflect and like be self-aware. I think that also can be like a downfall, right? Like I'm not perfect. I'm a perfectionist, and so that's an area that I need to grow, and probably wasn't as open as I could have been about like some of my flaws, right? But they also didn't lean into those as much. They were like, "Oh, tell me something about this," or like, "Speak further on this," and were able to paint me in a very positive light. And so then I think because of that, right, I am like, "Oh, let me preserve this image that people have of me. Let me not share things that may have wanted to share before, but not necessarily share those things because that doesn't fit who they think I am, right?" And so it's this game that's like very like meta, and have to be very mindful of, like they may be showing me this way, but I'm also very much so human, right? Like there are elements of me who are very ready for marriage and very ready for relationship, etc. And there's parts of me that are not, and that's okay. I think that like fitting, like trying to make sure that I was perceived in this way, especially after the show, was very, very like heavy on me. And so I think that was one thing. And I think another thing in particular is one of the challenges that I deal with every single day is talk about mental health, right? My mental health is something that I'm very like open about and like courageous about talking about, but also can be weaponized in a lot of ways, right? And especially when we're talking about love and relationships. It's, oh, is this person ready for marriage because he struggles with mental health challenges, right? Or like, does his depression make him not, like, why would someone sign up to be with someone who, right? Like, there's a lot of stigma around it. And how are we able to communicate? How are you able to communicate and be vulnerable and authentic about that, while also being aware that it can be spun and used against you? Some people, that is how they see you forever. And how do you repair that? Like, or do you ever prepare that? I think that's a process that was really tough for myself, my partner, and it's like continuing to be a thing that, as people have different touch points with the show or different touch points with us, are unable to shake that thought because of an attachment that they have to a person, that their character or their lived experience.
Yeah, there are desirable archetypes and undesirable archetypes, right? And that there's really no middle ground in between. You're either like someone who people don't like, or you're someone who people like, right? Because we want that drama, we want that tension, but that obviously there are drawbacks to falling in that undesirable archetype, right? You are perceived in a negative light. People are drawn to like perceiving your flaws, right? So we know kind of what the pitfalls are of that. But being cast in a positive archetype, as we were, also comes with its challenges, right? That like we are perceived in such a positive light, and we feel a need to fulfill that all the time. We feel a need to make sure that we are following through on productions or audiences' expectations of us, right? And that is its own kind of burden that we need to be aware of, right? Ahead of time. We need to know, like, even if I'm cast in a positive light, sure, that's great, right? But that is not a completely effortless, carefree experience either, right? That will require some intentionality. That will require a great degree of self-reflection, right? Because if you're constantly aspiring to fulfill that archetype that the show is imposing on you, you're losing your sense of self. You're losing that groundedness, right? That will keep the show a part of your life rather than you being part of the show.
What are some common reality TV archetypes that you've witnessed or you're aware of?
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, there's going to be, the breadth of my understanding is from, the experience we shared, right? So, like, within kind of the type of reality TV show we were on, right? You've got your playboy or playgirl, right? The people who are just like out and about, sleeping around, whatever it may be, and are finally have decided that they're ready for love, right? You've got those people.
Or are they ready?
Oh yeah, exactly. That comes with that question, right? And that is an undesirable archetype. We've got on the opposite end of that, the people who have just been so focused on their work, right? And they've devoted themselves to their 9 to 5. They work 80 hours a week, and their life is so full and so busy, but the only thing missing is that. Yeah, exactly. That one piece, right?
I think of another common archetype, especially when we talk about like blackness. I think about black women. They typically, when they're shown on reality TV, are like this good black woman who's just, her options are limited because she wants to date within her race, and because she wants to date within her race, like there aren't many good black men out there to find, right? Or conversely, she's been scorned by so many people and like is unwilling to be able to let guard down. Right? Totally. That's a common one that our culture has like been very intentional about like showing, whereas that might not be the lived experience, but fits a narrative or a story that people like to tell.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Miles, I'd like to ask about when you went into the show, what topics, subjects, personal traits, whatever it may be, were off the table for you?
Yeah, that was really. I feel like I was really intentional with things that were off the table for me. I'm pretty good at I think a strength of mine and a challenge of mine is I'm able to communicate the things that I want to communicate, and I'm not going to communicate about things I'm not. One of those things is as an educator, a person in the community, and just a person who I know my grandmother's watching, my parents are watching. I wasn't gonna talk about sex much. That's something that I was just not gonna be very transparent about. One of the things I was kind of on the fence about was like, I want to be authentic, so I do want to curse because I curse naturally. Something I need to work on and I want to be better about. But then also was like, I'm going to be very selective with the curse words I do use, right? I'm not going to I might use words that I probably won't have to get bleeped out. Like a PG-13 version of myself, right? Because I know I have kids who are students who are formerly watching, families, etc. And so very mindful of that. I wasn't very comfortable talking about finances publicly, not necessarily because I felt that I was unsafe sharing about those things, but it was just something that I'd rather talk about with my partner than talk about with the world.
Yeah.
I think those are the main things that were just like off the table. I think anything that I know that if it was clipped and sent to my grandmother, I wouldn't be proud of.
Yeah.
Or wasn't clipped and sent to my grandmother, I wouldn't be proud of. And so those are the ways that I kind of thought about like, what do I want to share and what do I not?
Yeah. That's real.
What about you? Anything off the table?
I mean, a lot of the same things you're talking about, sex, money, totally like wanted to, I mean, I knew I'd have to address those, but I wanted to make sure I addressed them in kind of a strategic way. I think also I didn't want to, I've had fallings out with people, right? I've had animosity with people, right? And I'm sure specifically with people who I'd been in relationships with in the past, right? Which is a huge topic of conversation, is like, tell us about your exes, right?
Yes.
And I was not going to talk about that, right? I was not going to put anyone who I had been close with at any point in time kind of within the realm of the TV show, because even though there might be some tension with them, even though there might be some degree of whatever it may be, resentment, right? That's still unfair to that person or those people to place them within the narrative of the show. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on kind of, once you're aware of what your archetype is, specifically if it is an undesirable archetype, what kind of control you might be able to exert, how you might be able to shape that archetype to make sure that you aren't cast in a negative light.
Yeah. That's a good point. I think I have a couple of tips on that. I think you have some form of control over, like, there's a lot of things that are out of your control, right? There's editing, there's the questions production's going to ask you, there's a lot of things that you're just not going to be able to control. Like, we didn't know what our archetypes were for a fact until like the show aired, right? However, there are ways to be able to make sure that things aren't your archetype. And I think one of those things is only sharing what you feel comfortable sharing. Do not share anything extra, right? The less is more. Like, do not communicate about things that you feel could be misconstrued. For example, if I'm telling a story about something sad that happened, right? If I don't want it to be, the context to be misconstrued, giving the facts and nothing more. Being very direct and very clear so that they cannot use any words against you.
Okay, so some tips. I want to recommend that you watch the reality TV show you're applying for and consider the types of people who usually appear on the show and how they are portrayed.
So activity 1 in this lesson is identify and write down your archetype. What are your most defining personal characteristics? How might these things feed into your archetype? Activity 2, write down what is off the table. Make a list of the topics that you cannot speak about or don't feel comfortable sharing on national TV. It can be something that you wouldn't want your grandparents to see or a potential employer. Make sure you do what is right for you.
Between lessons 1 and 2, you should have everything you need to step into this process with a sense of confidence. With that, we can go into the next phase, the first phase of the production process: applying and auditioning. We'll be covering that in Lesson 3.